Thanks, Cassandra. As she said, I'm Kelly Samick. I'm the Gulf Regional Lead in the National Sea Grant Office at NOAA. And I was the competition manager and the federal program officer for the cooperative award that's supporting the project that's the subject of today's webinar. Our intent was to establish a regional extension initiative to facilitate the connection of fisheries science concerning reef fish stocks with end users. We wanted an extension program that would, in part, complement and utilize the data and information produced from the congressionally mandated project that became known as the Great Red Snapper Count that was wrapping up at that time, as well as the Sea Grant Amberjack research and the South Atlantic Red Snapper research programs that have been recently initiated. We competed this opportunity amongst all the Sea Grant programs in the spring of 2021. Ultimately, the application submitted by the Mississippi-Alabama Sea Grant Consortium proposing a project entitled Extending Our Reach, a multi-state collaborative approach to reef fisheries extension, was selected for funding. Today we have with us the principal investigator, Dr. Marcus Drymon, and one of the co-PIs, Scott Baker, to talk to us about how the project unfolded. Dr. Drymon is an associate extension professor at Mississippi State University and a marine fisheries specialist with the Mississippi-Alabama Sea Grant. Originally from Kentucky, he earned his PhD in marine science from the University of South Alabama. Scott Baker is a fisheries specialist with North Carolina Sea Grant. A native of Washington, North Carolina, he holds a master's in oceanography and coastal sciences from Louisiana State University. And prior to joining Sea Grant, he worked as a biological science technician for NOAA Fisheries in Panama City, Florida. I want to thank Marcus and Scott for being with us today and the NOAA Library for hosting this webinar. And with that, Marcus, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Thank you, Cassandra. It's nice to be here this afternoon. I want to take just a moment to share my screen and then we'll get started. Fantastic. So as has been mentioned, this project is entitled Extending Our Reach, a multi-state collaborative approach to reef fish extension. And as you can see by the long list of names here at the bottom of the slide, this is a massive effort that involves a lot of people. So I'd like to acknowledge all of these folks for their really strong participation and help throughout this project. In particular, I'd like to thank Scott for being here today to help me talk through one of the more unique aspects of this work. So let's start with defining what the problem is, what the problem was that led to this initiative. As many of you know, results of federal stock assessments for some reef fishes, for example, Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America red snapper, have been at odds with the on-the-water observations of commercial and recreational fishermen. Now, this creates a disconnect that erodes stakeholder faith in the credibility of scientific findings. Consequently, significant congressional funding was allocated to alleviate this disparity. Example, the Great Red Snapper Count and the Greater Amberjack Count. However, funds to effectively disseminate those scientific findings to the appropriate stakeholders were lacking. So the goal of this project is to build on or enhance the conventional one-way or unidirectional flow of information, in other words, from research to management to stakeholder, by working directly with stakeholders to identify pressing research needs and communicate those needs to the scientific and management community. So in other words, changing the direction of that information flow to go from stakeholder to research and then to management. Now, there's no better group of people on the planet to do that than Sea Grant Fisheries Extension professionals. So as part of this project, we gathered those folks from across the southeastern United States, all across the Gulf, from Texas to Louisiana, Mississippi and Alabama, and Florida, but then turning around the coast of Florida and going up the east coast of the United States to include Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. But we didn't stop there. We also reached out to management representatives from both councils, so the Gulf Council and the South Atlantic Council, as well as the Caribbean Fishery Management Council. And then finally, we convened an advisory panel of commercial and recreational sector stakeholders. So as you can see, this truly is a massive project that involves a multitude of different folks. So very simply stated, the goals of this project were to gather, refine, and communicate information. Now, that makes for an easy way to convey the objectives of a project. They sound very simple, but as you might imagine, actually implementing those objectives is pretty complicated. So let's just step through them individually. How does one go about gathering information from such a wide group of stakeholders? Well, our idea was to use digital surveys. So just stakeholder surveys where we reach out through email and ask stakeholders a series of questions through a semi-structured interview process. Now, shown here is an example of what some of the outputs from a survey like that can look like. During the Great Red Snapper Count, we sent out such a survey and we asked people how satisfied they were, either with red snapper populations on the left-hand side of this plot, or with red snapper regulations on the right-hand side. And what you can see is that about 2/3 of people, composed here within the very satisfied and somewhat satisfied category, 2/3 of people were satisfied both with populations of red snapper in the Gulf and with regulations for red snapper in the Gulf. And then another quarter of respondents were kind of ambivalent, neither satisfied nor dissatisfied. So it's interesting to do surveys like this when you're trying to take the pulse of the room, for example, but we know that people's attitudes and perceptions and beliefs and satisfaction are likely to change from one year to the next. So if you remember, during this time we were conducting the Great Red Snapper Count, at the same time, a lot of the control and specific management of the red snapper population went from the federal level to individual states. And that was a change that people were by and large really satisfied with. So it makes sense that they would remain satisfied with red snapper populations or regulations during this time period. So as part of the Reef Fish Extension Program, our objective was to survey them in the first year of the project, but also the second year of the project and the third year of the project, so we could measure what we call longitudinal changes in people's satisfaction. Shown here is an example of that. We gauged anglers' satisfaction with, again, population levels on the left and current regulations on the right, but for more species than just red snapper, right? We also wanted to examine this for species like red grouper, Goliath grouper for that matter, hogfish, things like that. But the main purpose of this first objective, this gathering of information, was to see how people's satisfaction with each of these species varied from one year to the next to the next. Now, once we had gathered that data, that information, I like to think about a survey as being wide in so much as it samples a very large population, but it's relatively shallow. There's only so much you can ask with an electronic survey. On the other hand, in-person stakeholder focus group meetings like this, like I'm about to talk about, are narrow insofar as they only bring maybe a couple dozen folks to the room, but they're very deep, right? So our approach was to go both wide and shallow with the surveys and also narrow and deep with these stakeholder meetings. So during this portion, objective 2 of the project, you can see examples where in 2022, we convened an AP in San Antonio, Texas. In 2023, it was in New Orleans. 2024, it was in Gulf Shores, Alabama. And what we did was we asked the co-PIs from each Sea Grant program to identify stakeholders that they wanted to bring to this meeting. And we had funds to pay for their travel and their lodging and their food and whatnot. And the thought was that the individual folks at each Sea Grant program would be best positioned to know what the right stakeholders were to bring to each of these meetings. And so we convened a one-day workshop, and this was in accordance with the Gulf States Marine Fisheries Commission meetings, so that if folks wanted to hang around and spend another day or two at these locations, they could do so and get a further glimpse into how reef fish and reef fish fisheries are managed in the Gulf. So after gathering the information with surveys, refining the information through these stakeholder workshops, we were able to learn things that we hadn't really considered before. So for example, the surveys gave us a lot of information about people's satisfaction with a lot of specific reef fish. But during these stakeholder workshops, folks from the Caribbean said, hey, there was something on the survey, or there was something not on the survey that we wanted to talk about. And it's these really relatively recent and massive influxes of sargassum. So that's something that we hadn't identified as an important topic on our survey. But throughout the process of these advisory panels with these stakeholders, we could identify yet another issue that was really important to them that needed to be further examined. So, objective one, gather the information. Objective two, refine that information with a group of experts. Objective three is then taking that information that we both gathered and refined and then communicating it with our respective stakeholder groups. And here's where we really gave a lot of latitude to each of the individual co-PIs. We know that, for example, shown here is a brochure from Texas. We know Texas anglers like to receive information a certain way, and that may be very different than the way an angler in Louisiana gets their information, which is likely different from how someone in North Carolina gets their information. So using, again, Texas as an example, you'll see that this brochure has Texas specific fish with, taken with Texans in the background here. And in fact, if you look at the skiff on the bottom right-hand side, you would recognize that as the type of boat that's really common in the flats areas of Texas. So we gave a lot of latitude to each of the individual programs to give this information, communicate this information in a way that makes sense to them. An example from where I am, Mississippi-Alabama Sea Grant Consortium, we put together a small book titled Fishes, which is Fishermen Invested in Science, Healthy Ecosystems, and Sustainability. And along with this book, we put together a 5-week extension course where we brought people into the extension center here and gave them essentially a fisheries 101 style course following the outline of this book, which was really tailored to anglers in Mississippi and Alabama. And then, Florida chose a totally different mechanism for using the funds that they got through the Reef Fish Extension Program. They invested in a program called the Florida Friendly Fishing Guide Program. Details of that are shown here. But this objective, this portion of the project was perhaps one of my favorites because it allowed people to say, man, if I just had a little bit of extra funding, how would I best reach the stakeholders in my area? And this project, this big consortium just allowed those Sea Grant specialists to reach those stakeholders in that determined way. But one of my favorite ways that these individual Sea Grant programs chose to structure that additional funding is the way that they did it along the East Coast of the United States. And so rather than talk about that myself, I've invited the co-PI from the project, Scott Baker, to give us a rundown of that. This is something that was Scott's idea, and he was a real champion for it, and I think it really turned out well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now. We'll switch gears and let Scott pull up some slides and talk us through the idea that he had.
Thank you, Marcus. Yeah, let me just get this going here. So, thank you for that great introduction. That was Marcus did a great job presenting the grand scale of this project. And I want to talk a little bit about how we did it here on the South Atlantic, and I'll just provide a little bit of background to our thought process. And I think there's a lot of things that were occurring at the time of this project, particularly when these funds came available. And for those of you who are not familiar with fisheries research, and particularly for fisheries research funding at the federal level for projects, the amount of money that was going towards red snapper and amberjack were in the multiple millions of dollars. And I can tell you, as someone who reviews a lot of proposals and grants and writes things, that's an order of magnitude beyond the largest type grants that we see. So those are very it's just very different, right? And also from the Sea Grant fisheries perspective, we're often out on the street talking to people, also talking to those researchers, and then to see that name of Sea Grant associated with these multi-million-dollar programs that also it's also good and bad in that it says, well, how is Sea Grant giving all this money out when in reality it's not Sea Grant money, it's congressionally supported money. But the fact is, this is like a great opportunity to really bring in our partners. And some other things, the way that kind of led to our thought process here is thinking about how Marcos is talking about the Gulf, and we have the same species on the South Atlantic, but in some cases completely different rules, completely different issues. And so we can't exactly speak with the same voice all the time, particularly when we're trying to engage with the angling public. So we really need to be cognizant of that. And also, at about the same time, there was also a lot of, I won't call them duplicating efforts, but there were a lot of efforts, promoting descending devices and venting and barotrauma mitigation. And these were being done by different entities. Some of these were state agencies, some of these were nonprofits. There was a little bit of federal activity. And some of these had different timescales, had different, had incentives versus no incentives. So there's a lot of already activity in this space. And so we were kind of faced with a choice. Do we ramp up something new that might compete with this? Do we tag on to something that's existing to support that, enhance that? And that was kind of a big factor in how we thought through these things. But ultimately, we started thinking about a long-standing partner. Marcus discussed the fishery management councils. And at least with the fishery management councils, obviously they're the ones who are, help developing the rules and regulations, but also spending, as much time, if not more, than Sea Grant interacting with the public. And then at least with the South Atlantic Council, they've been steadily developing two kind of similar track programs, a best fishing practices program and a citizen science program, both ways to really engage the angling public. And so to us, it seemed like the council was a natural fit. And I won't say that this idea came from nowhere for this, Reef Fish Extension and Communication Fellowship. A few years before this project started, North Carolina Sea Grant started a North Carolina STEM Policy Fellowship, which is not completely different or not somewhat similar than the Canals program that happens at the national level. So recent graduate students who graduated from North Carolina universities can get paired with the line item offices within the state. So think of Department of Transportation, Environmental Quality, Department of Energy, Commerce. And that program has been growing, but it's a great way for those, recent, early career professionals to kind of get a leg into the door with some of these state agencies to practice what they preach in terms of policy development and working with stakeholders. And so this seemed like a great way to bring that idea over to the fish world. Sea Grant and NOAA have several partnerships together where they look at stock assessment science and economics and also coastal management. But this seemed like a great avenue to create a new path of this extension and communication fellowship. And great. And the cool thing is that, it can blend the needs of both the Sea Grant organizations and also the council. So with Marcus's funding, which was very unusual in that we had 4 years, so we had the ability to create up to four fellowships. 4 annual fellowships. We're actually on our 3rd one now, and with the no cost extension, we're hoping to have one more fellowship here at the end. The way that it worked was a little bit unusual. We had a piece of the pie, so to speak, for the South Atlantic, and with each of those pieces going to each individual state, no state really had enough to create a fellowship program on their own. So we did some horse trading, and North Carolina received a lion's share of the money to be able to create the stipend based payment system that we used in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, and also North Carolina, kind of got some programmatic money in terms of travel and supplies and media trips and things, what I'll talk about. And of course, the hero here is Florida Sea Grant, which was involved with both the Gulf and the South Atlantic aspects. But because North Carolina didn't have enough match money to complete the application, Florida stepped in and really overmatched their component to make us whole so that we could create this program. So in other words, all four programs were really involved, at least in kind of creating this fellowship. And of course, the council is a huge partner, where the funding came from Sea Grant through this grant program. The council, provided day-to-day supervision with the council staff, also an office space, some travel support, a computer, those kinds of things. And of course, Sea Grant staff from the Southeast and from this whole project entirely kind of gave support and mentorship to those people. Just want to walk through a couple things of the way that the work plan was developed, because we had to have some activities within our work plan to kind of support Marcus's vision, but also the needs of the South Atlantic. One of those was, again, tackling some of these issues that the council had set aside as priorities. These were priorities that the council had to further their outreach mission, but in a lot of cases didn't have the manpower to kind of do some of these things. One of those was basically developing a database and an active outreach component with brick and mortar tackle stores and tackle owners, because numerous research studies have shown and public engagements has shown that fishermen get their information from a lot of places, but they really like to go to tackle shops. I mean, these are where the experts live, so to speak. So it's been a great way for the council and for Sea Grant to kind of get into these avenues, talk to people, try to set up a continuing line of communication, so it's not just coming from one source, type of thing. So that's been great, and the fellow with the council has made great strides in putting that database together and facilitating that relationship. Another component is literally, building off of that is, hands-on seminars and webinars. A lot of these invitations to do these types of traditional outreach communication events come by engaging with these owners at these tackle shops. They're like, great, hey, you want to come give a seminar? I'll invite people. We'll get pizza, we'll do whatever. You want to talk about, bear trauma? That'd be great. So that has opened a lot of doors, and the council has shown several slides showing this, the spiders network of how things have expanded, with getting boots on the ground since this thing has happened. And also, that's Dave on the left side of the screen, and Mark Phelps. He's a charter captain out of Charleston who's participated in a lot of seminars, and they've also done both virtual and hands-on seminars. Again, talking about some of the great work happened with the red snapper count, the amberjack count, and most recently the red snapper research program in the South Atlantic. One of the coolest things is our media trips, and I'm covering up the slide, but it's called media trips, and is an example from public broadcast system in North Carolina. And again, I can't say that we came up with this idea on our own. The best, the highest form of flattery in Sea Grant is copying someone else's program. And we basically are copying this from Florida Sea Grant, who did this probably starting a dozen years ago, where they identified that if they could go out with some of these very influential folks and bring along some media and really show people what they were trying to tell them, that was a great way for people to learn, and that was a great way for anglers to share information amongst themselves. So just the aspect of identifying these captains, creating the relationships, organizing these trips, it was a big deal. And we've had some success with that. This is just some screenshots of one trip that I'd like to highlight. This trip occurred off North Carolina in October 2023. The QR code is a link to the video should you want to scan your phone and watch it later. It's a pretty short video, but it just kind of goes to show, describe, in a great storytelling way. It describes the nature of the problem, what the solution is, and then, how do we convince other people that the time is right, that people need to act responsibly and take care of the resource by handling fish in certain ways. And so this was a great, the backstory of this was a great way to work with PBS&C. They have a great channel called Science and Sea, and I had some connections. Some other people had connections with this group, and David, who's a fellow on the screen top right, he had connections with the charter captain, who's also a council member, that took us out, and we designed the trip to occur next to the NOAA Beaufort lab, so we had some NOAA Beaufort lab scientists who were there. So it was just the ability to network and bring this all together. And, we were really pleased with this. So my last slide is I just wanted to show what I think is the potential for this type of kind of unique fellowship beyond our audience in the Southeast. As many of the viewers probably know, we have a large number of sea grant programs spread all over the country, and including all the different 8, regional fishery management council regions. Marcus and I have kind of described the challenges that we have with, recreational and commercial saltwater fisheries with reef fish in the South Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico. But, all these other regions, they all have their own unique challenges. And the consistency here, I think, is that, we've got the councils and Sea Grant, but, of course, a lot of fishermen want the same thing, want better science, want better data, want better communication. So this might be something to think about, should others want to try to expand this, into other areas. And with that, thanks for listening, and I'm going to try to hand it back to Marcus.
Got it. Thanks, thanks, Scott. That was perfect. I'm just going to share my screen one more time, just to throw up sort of an acknowledgement slide. I think it's important, just to give everybody, a feel for the real breadth of participation in this project. I mean, it's been an absolute joy to work on. You see all these smiling faces, predominantly from Sea Grant, and just, the time and the effort that these folks sink into their local fisheries. I mean, there's no better person to speak about, fisheries in a certain area than the local Sea Grant fisheries person. So thank you very much to Scott for sharing some time to share, his thoughts on the way they handled their funding for this project. I think it was a really novel and interesting approach. Thanks again to Kelly for the invitation to give this seminar, and thank you guys for listening. I would certainly, myself and Scott would love to answer any questions that you have.
Awesome. Thank you both very much for your presentation. This is Cassandra again from NOAA Library, everyone. We have plenty of time to answer your questions. Please feel free to type them into the Q&A chat, and I will upload them for our speakers. And with that, we will give everyone just a little bit of time to get their questions in.
Marcus.
Yes,
I was going
sir.
to say, imagine the questions we get if we were making the rules.
Yeah, no, I would have already signed off.
Thank you all for coming by. Click.
Yeah, right. It's been great. Have a good one.
Okay, we've had our first question come in. Let me get that up on the screen for you all. Marcus, what was the feedback from Mississippi-Alabama about needs?
Yeah, so great question. Mississippi and Alabama, when it comes to reef fish, it's a unique situation, right? We're really talking about red snapper. I mean, let's just be honest. That's kind of what we deal with respect to reef fishes. And I think there's just a general lack, especially in Mississippi, I'll say, a lack of understanding of how to get involved in the process. How to be an active member of the management community, what a Gulf Council meeting is, what a commission meeting is, what the SSC is, things like that. So I think just the opportunity to interact with reef fish fishermen in Mississippi and Alabama was a really beneficial part of this project. Now it's different in Alabama; they tend to be a bit more engaged. Alabama has a bigger reef fish fishery, especially in the kind of Orange Beach, Gulf Shores area. But still, just interacting with those guys as part of this has been it's been a real treat.
Thank you for your response. Our next question is, what were some of the lessons learned for working with state resource agencies and councils?
Yeah, I don't mind tackling that first, and Scott, feel free just to jump in. I mean, Scott said it really well. Like, there's a lot of nuance, there between the different councils. Not to mention the Caribbean Fishery Management Council. We had a lot of participants come from Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands and places like that. Talk about a whole different, situation over there. Issues that we don't really even think of so much sometimes. But yeah, I mean, Scott said it well when he pointed out, red snapper is a whole different beast in the Gulf than it is in the South Atlantic. And so just, sharing that awareness with folks was something good that came out of this project, but it's simultaneously a challenge. Every region has their own regulations. Of course, in the Gulf, every state has their own regulations and different seasons and all of those sorts of things. But, not to keep going back to this, but it really does, it really highlights the benefit of the approach that Scott and his team took by saying, you know what, we want to put this funding towards one specific person who can be the mouthpiece for reef fish fisheries and be that liaison with the council. So that was really, that really was a tremendous lesson that I learned from this process, is watching how well that interaction was received. I mean, we've gotten so much positive feedback from folks that say, man, this is a great idea. We should have this fellow, like, we should make that a more permanent situation across other areas.
Yeah, I'll just add that, yeah, each of the, at least in the South Atlantic, reef fish are at the state level, they could be very important or moderately important, right? So that was part of the reason for doing the fellowship, because some of us had established programs that we felt we could put money behind this and like improve it, but others didn't. So we didn't want to like leave anybody behind or make someone kind of do something on their own if they weren't like really committed to doing it. So I think that's kind of, and I guess, and all of us were like, we have other jobs, right, or other things to do than reef fish. So like, wouldn't it be great if we had a dedicated person that we could put our support behind? And I've seen that particularly the council and the states have really, I think they really like that. And particularly, this is kind of going way back, but pre-COVID, I would say maybe even 10 years ago, there's a lot of outreach activity, a lot of in-person advisory panel meetings, public comment period meetings. And then, for the lack of, with technology and things, a lot of things went virtual. There's a lot of, it's now the states and agencies can save so much money by having a Zoom meeting instead of a local meeting, but you're losing that connection with people. And so now these agencies are trying to ramp back up with people, and not having those people, you're kind of starting from scratch again. And so, and the public, they want the switch turned on right away, right? They want to get rid of one and start the other, but it's not that simple. So I think this has been a good way to kind of jumpstart that.
Great. Thank you very much for your response. Our next question is, if you had one issue you would like fixed in the program or improved, what would be the issue you think is your top focus?
Wow, that's a great question. and I hope this doesn't come across as me just punting, but if there was one thing I could improve about the program, it would just be to extend the funding window. I mean, this has worked really well for several reasons. It's allowed us to, interview that same subsection of anglers over time and see how their attitudes and satisfaction is changing, which is something that hadn't been done. It allowed us to bring, stakeholders to an in-person meeting, just like Scott said, which is extraordinarily valuable. A lot of them were happy to come the second and third years after they had already been the first year, which is tough. Sometimes you take someone to a meeting and they say, man, I never want to do that again. But we had a lot of folks that wanted to come back. And then, most importantly, it was an opportunity just to say, hey, each of you Sea Grant programs that are doing something good, here's a little boost to help you get more scope, maybe a broader reach, maybe hire somebody, or maybe do something totally different like this fellow. So if there's one thing I could improve, it would just be, to do it again. I hate that it's ending.
Yeah, I'll second what Marcus said. One thing that's often a challenge with some of these federal grants and other issues is um, the outreach. The outreach and educational programs kind of have to get shoehorned into the research template. So, in other words, that often means no dedicated money for food, for beverages. These are often evening events. You're trying to get people to engage with them, but you're also like, bring your Coke and your naps for dinner because we can't provide any food for you. So if there were ways to grease the skids for those types of things, I think a lot of these programs could be improved.
Great, thank you. Our next question is there a shortage at the moment with certain fishes and ideas needed to fix this issue?
So I just want to be clear. I understand a shortage with certain fishes, like, are certain populations being over harvested? Is that the idea?
I think it's referring back to the question of if you had one issue you would like fixed in the program or improved, what issue would be your top focus? I believe it's a follow-up to that question.
Okay. Okay. Um, okay. I see. Yes. Gosh. I think about the next kind of, group of fishes that we would focus on. I don't know. I mean, reef fish is really a topical issue, and it remains so. Like Scott said, it's such a big group of fishes. It encompasses so many different species that, I think it's the right group to focus on for the foreseeable future, at least. I guess you could expand that to things like cobia. Um, yeah, cobia, potentially triple tail, some of these coastal pelagics. But really, when I think about fisheries that would benefit from this type of project, reef fish are really high up on the list.
The next question. I wrote a report on sargassum blooms for a class at FGCU. Has there been any refinements on how to handle it?
So, Ryan, that's such a good question. I really had a good time looking into that issue after it was identified by our Caribbean stakeholders. They're like, man, this sargassum thing has gotten out of control. I'll admit I had to do a kind of deep dive to figure out what was going on. But there's a lot of really good literature out there that shows that the dynamics of the Western North Atlantic Ocean have shifted over the past couple decades. And so now a lot of sargassum that used to come into the Gulf is now going further south into the Caribbean. And they are coming up with some pretty innovative ways to deal with it, making like substitutes for concrete blocks that you can build houses with, all sorts of really interesting things. So it's a good example of when nature gives us a problem, to deal with. There's always going to be folks that come up with innovative ways to sort of take advantage of that. So yeah, I'll be keeping my eyes open for the next couple of years to see how people continue to develop ways that they're using excess sargassum that washes up on these beaches.
Excellent. Thank you. And then our next question in the queue is, has anyone thought about creating a international waters fishery with the sole purpose of control breeding?
So that's an interesting question. I mean, there are international fisheries, that operate in international waters, and I know increasingly there are efforts to have dedicated sort of fish stocking and breeding programs further and further offshore. But specifically, I can't think of any sort of efforts to create international, fishery breeding type programs. But that doesn't mean, that's not to say it doesn't happen. I'm just not familiar with any.
All right, thank you. And then the next question, could this research be applied to other fisheries besides reef fish?
100%. I mean, the model that we established and the model that we kind of pushed forward through this project could really pretty easily be applied to a suite of other different types of fish. These coastal pelagics, these coastal migratory fish are a great example. Some of the HMS, the highly migratory species, would be good candidates. So, yeah, I think it's really, really broadly applicable. You could almost name your species group and it would benefit from an approach like this.
Is there a non-federal match requirement for these programs?
Yeah, so that's a very specific question, but an important one. Sea Grant is required to obtain a 50% non-federal match for all the funds that they distribute. So in other words, if you want to request $100 from Sea Grant, you have to show them you got at least $50 that you can add to the effort. And that's one of the ways legislatively that Sea Grant makes sure that it's providing really good return on investment. So yes, this was a huge funding slug that we were able to tap into and to take advantage of, but it did require that we come up with a lot of match. So whether that's saying, okay, if we're able to if we can get this funding, we would also supplement that with 50% of that total value from sources A, B, C, D, and E. So yeah, all that does is just, extend the amount of influence and output that these programs, these Sea Grant programs, are able to provide.
I have been working with NOAA to enhance their surveys and needed fisheries management input to narrow the research. Do you have a recommended method for getting in contact with the right people?
Goodness. Let's see here. Enhance their surveys and needed fishery management input to narrow the research. Yeah, NOAA, especially over the past 5 years, maybe even a little longer, has done a really good job of enhancing their web resources. That's where I would start. They've got a really exhaustive website, with lots of different links to lots of different things like that. And I would say the same for the National Sea Grant Office. I mean, it's kind of mind blowing to see how much information is contained just in those two resources alone. Those branch off and spiderweb a million different directions, but one could really spend an entire lifetime just digging down into the depths of those two resources. So those are certainly the two places I would start with.
Awesome, thank you. Our next question we have is, are there any locations you would love to recommend your program to?
So if I understand correctly, where else could a program like this be implemented? If I'm understanding that correctly, then yeah, I would say really anywhere. The New England area, of course, they don't have the same types of fishes that we do, but similarly important fisheries there. The Pacific Northwest, of course, areas like Hawaii would certainly benefit from approaches like this. It's kind of that this template that could be really, really used almost anywhere.
The next question that we have, I know you wish to improve the funding window. Have you thought about teaming with fishing boats, like a cross event where their business gets promoted, but you can use their boats for your events, like as a fishing trip?
Yeah, 100%. That's a really great question. And in fact, I've seen a general migration in our field towards that in the past 10 plus years. It used to be that when scientists wanted to do work, they'd get on a scientific boat and go do X, Y, and Z. But increasingly, we work with charter fishermen, commercial fishermen, what have you, even private rec fishermen, to get out on the water. And that, that's kind of a win-win. Sometimes that provides some extra funding to the charter fishermen, for example, but it also allows us as scientists to really take advantage of this wealth of knowledge, this on the water experience that these guys have, that no matter how many textbooks we read or how many years we spend studying stuff, we'll never be able to kind of catch up to that institutional knowledge. So yes, the short answer is I'm a huge fan of what we collectively call cooperative research programs, and scientists getting on the boats with fishermen is always a really good idea.
I
Yeah.
agree with you there. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to put a plug for what Marcus said, and particularly, I would say, and this ends the last question, but particularly, I will say, in these regions of the country, so the Southeast, the Gulf and the South Atlantic, and maybe the Mid Atlantic, we have, the number of people that participate in our fisheries, particularly recreational, are many, many orders of magnitude more than the commercial voices. And so all those voices have to be satisfied, they have to receive the information, right? And so, like, anything that we can do to get the word out, to appease people, to better utilize our limited resources with, fishery independent surveys on private boats, all these things, we need to be doing all of these things. So I think that was a great question.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. That is all the questions we've had in the queue at the moment. I'm giving it just another 10 seconds in case anyone was in the middle of typing a question. And then I suppose we can wrap things up and end a little bit early. I would like to thank you both again for sharing your work with us today. And thank you, Kelly, for organizing this event. Audience, we hope to see you at our next library seminar. Thank you all for attending and enjoy the rest of your day.